Some folks say loneliness is a choice, but Buck Morrison knew better. Sometimes life just strips away everyone you love until silence becomes your only companion. For 30 years, he'd walked these mountain trails with nothing but his old dog Boone, believing he was meant to live and die alone in the high country. But on this December night, with the blizzard howling down from the peaks, Boone started acting strange. The dog kept pulling toward a grove of pines, whimpering and pawing at the snow. When they pushed through the drifts, Buck saw something impossible, a massive hollow stump glowing with firelight from inside. Smoke curled up from a makeshift chimney, and through a crack in the bark, he could see flames dancing against rough walls. Someone had turned this old stump into a tiny shelter, but what Buck would find inside would change everything he thought he knew about family and second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that night carried memories Buck Morrison preferred to keep buried, but 30 years in these mountains had taught him that some ghosts never rest easy. He'd built his life in the high country of Montana's Glacier National Park region, where the nearest neighbor lived 47 miles down a road that disappeared under snow from November to April. Most folks thought he was crazy for choosing such isolation, but Buck knew better. Sometimes a man needed distance from the world to keep his sanity intact. His cabin sat tucked into a natural clearing at 8,000 feet. Surrounded by towering pines and ancient spruces that had weathered storms longer than most towns had existed. Buck had chosen this spot, carefully protected from the worst winds, near a reliable spring, with clear sightlines in all directions. The structure itself was a testament to patience and skill, built from hand-selected logs and chinked with a mixture of clay and pine pitch that kept out even the fiercest mountain cold. Inside, the cabin reflected a life stripped down to essentials. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened from decades of use. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, though he rarely had use for the second, shelves lined with books on everything from wilderness survival to philosophy. In the corner sat his most prized possession, a hand-carved wooden chess set, each piece whittled during the long winter of his 3rd year alone. The intricate knights and detailed bishops spoke to the patience that mountain living demanded and the intelligence that had served him well in his former life. Buck had been the foreman of the Triple Crown Ranch outside Billings for 15 years before everything changed. Those had been good years, managing 12,000 head of cattle, supervising 24 cowboys, planning grazing, rotations, and breeding programs. He'd been respected, well paid, and married to Elena, the most beautiful woman in 3 counties. They'd been trying for children, had picked out names, painted a nursery in soft yellow because they wanted to be surprised. The accident happened on a Tuesday in April. Elena was driving to her doctor's appointment in town 8 months along and glowing with that special light pregnant women carry. A drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. The impact killed Elena instantly. Their son, they learned afterward it would have been a son, died with her. Buck had handled the funeral arrangements with the same methodical precision he'd brought to ranch work. He'd shaken hands with mourners, accepted condolences, and stood beside the twin graves under a grey sky that seemed permanently stained with grief. But something fundamental had broken inside him that day. The ranch, with its constant noise and human interaction, became unbearable. That empty house he'd shared with Elena felt like a tomb. Even the well-meaning sympathy of friends and neighbors felt like salt in an open wound. So he'd loaded his truck with essentials, called his old blue-tick hound Boone, and driven into the mountains with no intention of ever coming back. That was 30 years ago, when Buck was 37 and still believed that healing was possible. Now, at 67, he'd long since accepted that some wounds never close, they just become part of who you are. Boone had been his salvation in those early years. Buck had found the puppy half-starved and abandoned at a gas station on his drive into the mountains, a ball of fur with oversized paws and the saddest eyes he'd ever seen. Something about that look of abandonment had spoken to him, and before he knew it, the pup was riding shotgun toward an uncertain future. The dog wore a collar Buck had made from leather salvaged from his old ranch gear, stamped with the Triple Crown brand, one of the few reminders he'd kept of his previous life. Over the years, that collar had faded and cracked, but like everything else in Buck's world, it was built to last. Boone had grown into a magnificent hunting dog, loyal beyond measure and possessed of an uncanny ability to sense trouble long before it arrived. Their daily routine had evolved into a comfortable rhythm over the decades. Dawn found them checking the trapline Buck maintained for food and fur, not because he needed the money, but because mountain living demanded practical skills. Boone would range ahead, nose to the ground, alert for signs of game or danger. They'd return to the cabin for breakfast, usually coffee so strong it could wake the dead, eggs from the chickens, Buck kept in a reinforced coop, and whatever meat they'd preserved from the last hunting season. Mornings were for maintenance, splitting wood, repairing equipment, checking supplies. Buck had learned early that neglecting small problems in the mountains could quickly become life-threatening situations. A loose roof shingle might seem minor in September, but by January it could mean the difference between a warm cabin and a deadly cold snap. Afternoons were often spent reading. Buck had accumulated an impressive library over the years, trading with the supply store owner in the nearest town for books on philosophy, history, and literature. Marcus Aurelius sat next to Edward Abbey, while Thoreau shared shelf space with modern survival manuals. These books had become his companions in the long winter evenings, their wisdom helping him make sense of solitude and find peace in simplicity. The chess set had been born during his fourth winter, when cabin fever nearly drove him back to civilization. Carving the pieces had given his hands something to do during the endless dark months, and playing against himself had kept his mind sharp. Each piece was a work of art, the king noble and strong, the queen fierce and protective, the pawns humble but essential. He'd spent 3 months on the set, working by firelight and taking breaks to walk with Boone through the frozen landscape. Buck's reputation among the few locals who knew of his existence was that of a hermit, but a respected one. The owner of Morrison's general store, no relation, despite the shared name, had been trading with him for decades, exchanging supplies for the high-quality furs and occasional craftwork Buck produced. The store owner, Jim Morrison, had learned early not to ask personal questions or push for conversation. Buck would appear 3 or 4 times a year, conduct his business efficiently, and disappear back into the mountains like a ghost. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, had checked on Buck exactly once in 30 years during his first winter alone. He'd found Buck well-prepared, self-sufficient, and clearly wanting to be left alone. Bradley was a practical man who understood that some folks needed solitude, like others needed company. As long as Buck wasn't causing trouble or putting others at risk, the sheriff was content to let him be. But despite his self-sufficiency and acceptance of solitude, Buck couldn't entirely escape the weight of loneliness. It settled over him some evenings like mountain fog, thick and suffocating. He'd catch himself talking to Boone more than necessary, or pausing at the chessboard as if waiting for an opponent who would never come. The silence that had once been a balm for his grief had gradually become its own kind of burden. He'd decorated his cabin sparingly, but the few personal touches revealed glimpses of the man he'd once been. A photograph of Elena sat on the mantel, faded but still beautiful. His old ranch hat hung on a peg by the door, sweat-stained and shapeless, but too full of memories to throw away. A small wooden cross Elena had given him for their anniversary remained on the bedside table, worn smooth by years of absent-minded handling during restless nights. Winter was always the hardest season. The snow came early and stayed late at his elevation, sometimes isolating him completely for months. He'd learned to prepare, meticulously preserving meat, stockpiling firewood, checking and double-checking his equipment. But no amount of preparation could shield him from the psychological challenges of absolute isolation. The silence could become oppressive, broken only by the whistle of wind through the eaves and the occasional crack of settling timbers. Boone sensed these dark moods and would position himself closer to Buck during the worst times, offering the simple comfort of warm presence. The dog had aged gracefully, developing grey around his muzzle and a slight stiffness in his gait, but his loyalty remained absolute. Buck often wondered what would happen when Boone inevitably passed on. The thought of facing these mountains entirely alone was almost unbearable. This particular December had been unusually harsh, with back-to-back storms that kept them cabin-bound for days at a time. The snow had piled higher than Buck could remember, creating drifts that transformed familiar landmarks into alien sculptures. But the storms had finally broken, leaving behind a crystalline world of impossible beauty and bitter cold. Buck had decided to check his farthest trapline before another storm system moved in. It was a full day's journey through challenging terrain, but the exercise would do them both good after days of confinement. He'd loaded his pack with emergency supplies, strapped on his snowshoes, and set out with Boone ranging ahead, both of them grateful for the freedom of movement. The wind that night, as they made their way back toward the cabin, carried a sharpness that promised more snow. Buck could read the mountain weather like a familiar book, the way the clouds gathered, the direction of the wind, the particular quality of light that preceded a serious storm. They needed to reach shelter soon, but Boone's strange behavior had led them off the familiar trail into uncharted territory. Buck trusted the dog's instincts completely. In 30 years together, Boone had never led him astray. If the dog was insisting they investigate something in these remote pines, Buck would follow. He'd learned long ago that survival in the mountains often depended on paying attention to signals others might dismiss. Now, standing before this impossible sight, a hollow stump transformed into a dwelling, glowing with warmth in the midst of a brutal blizzard, Buck felt something stir inside him that he'd thought long dead. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that after 30 years of choosing isolation, fate had other plans for this bitter December night. Buck approached the glowing stump with the caution that had kept him alive for 3 decades in unforgiving country. His right hand instinctively moved to the one-time .357 Magnum, holstered at his hip, not out of aggression, but from the practical understanding that anything unexpected in the mountains could mean danger. Boone stayed close to his side, hackles slightly raised but tail wagging with nervous energy, as if the dog sensed something extraordinary but not necessarily threatening. The structure before them defied all logic. What appeared to be an ancient Douglas fir stump, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, had been hollowed out and transformed into a makeshift dwelling. A thin stream of smoke emerged from a crude chimney fashioned from stacked stones, and the warm light flickering through gaps in the bark suggested a fire burning within. Someone had draped a heavy tarp over part of the opening, creating a door of sorts that flapped gently in the wind. Buck circled the stump once, his experienced eyes reading the snow for tracks. He found the evidence. He was looking for small footprints, mostly filled in by the falling snow, but still visible to someone who knew how to look. A woman's tracks, he judged, and recent. The depth and spacing suggested someone carrying extra weight, moving slowly and with obvious exhaustion. "Hello in there," Buck called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "My name's Buck Morrison. I'm not here to cause trouble." The response was immediate and alarming, a woman's voice, high with fear and desperation. "Go away. Please, just leave us alone." The word "us" hit Buck like a physical blow. There was more than one person inside this impossible shelter, and from the panic in the voice, they were in serious trouble. He'd spent enough years alone to recognize the sound of someone at the very edge of survival. "Ma'am, there's a blizzard coming," Buck said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "This storm's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. I've got a cabin about 2 miles from here, warm and stocked with food. Whatever trouble you're running from, freezing to death won't solve it." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind gathering. Strength in the treetops, Buck waited with the patience that mountain living had taught him. Pushing would only increase their fear and potentially drive them deeper into danger. Finally, the makeshift door moved aside, and Buck found himself looking at a young woman who appeared to be carved from desperation itself. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair matted against her head and green eyes that held the wild look of a cornered animal. Her clothes, jeans, and a thin jacket, wholly inadequate for mountain winter, were soaked through with melted snow. She clutched something against her chest, wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket. "You're really alone?" she asked, her voice shaking from cold and fear. "Just me and my dog," Buck replied, gesturing toward Boone, who had assumed his least threatening posture, sitting with his tail wagging slowly. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, then seemed to immediately regret giving even that much information. Buck's attention was drawn to the bundle she held so protectively. A tiny sound emerged from within the blanket, the weak cry of a newborn baby. The sound sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. A baby, out here in this weather, with inadequate shelter and no proper supplies. They had hours at most before hypothermia claimed them both. "Sarah, how long have you been out here?" Buck asked, taking a careful step closer. 3 days, she said, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. "Maybe 4. I can't remember." Buck's mind raced through the implications. 3 or 4 days in this weather, with a newborn, surviving in a hollowed-out stump with minimal fire and no proper food or medical supplies. The fact that they were still alive was nothing short of miraculous. "The baby," Buck said gently. "Is she okay?" Sarah's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know. She's so cold, and she won't eat much, and I think—" Her voice broke entirely. Buck made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over 30 years of careful solitude. "We need to get you both to my cabin right now. This storm is going to hit hard in the next hour, and this shelter won't protect you from what's coming." "I can't," Sarah said, backing deeper into the stump. "You don't understand. There are people looking for me, and if they find me, they won't find you in my cabin," Buck said firmly. "But they'll find 2 frozen bodies out here come spring, if we don't move now." As if summoned by his words, a gust of wind howled through the trees with unusual ferocity, sending snow swirling around them like angry spirits. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Buck could feel the building pressure that meant serious weather was imminent. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you to trust me," Buck said, extending his hand toward her. "I've been living in these mountains longer than you've been, alive. I know what this country can do to people, and I know what it takes to survive it. Whatever you're running from, it can't be worse than what will happen if you stay out here tonight." The young woman looked between Buck's weathered face and the bundle in her arms. The baby's cries had grown weaker, which Buck knew was a dangerous sign. Hypothermia in infants could progress rapidly, and once it reached a certain point, even rescue became meaningless. "He said he'd find me anywhere," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Buck. "Said I couldn't hide from him, couldn't protect her." "Who said that?" Buck asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The fear in her eyes, the way she held the baby protectively, the desperate flight into the wilderness, it all pointed to a familiar and tragic story. "Her father," Sarah said, the words barely audible above the wind. "My husband." Buck felt a familiar anger stirring in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him to champion the underdog during his ranch days. He'd seen enough domestic violence in his time to recognize the signs, and the sight of this young mother and her infant, driven to such extremes, awakened protective instincts he'd thought long buried. "Well, he's not here now," Buck said with quiet authority. "And he won't find you where we're going. But first, we need to make sure you and the baby live through the next few hours." As if responding to the urgency in his voice, the baby's cries grew more distressed. Sarah looked down at the bundle in her arms with an expression of pure heartbreak. And Buck saw the exact moment when maternal instinct overcame fear of pursuit. "Okay," she said, struggling to her feet. "But if anything happens to her because I trusted you—" "Nothing's going to happen to her," Buck said, already moving to gather what few supplies were visible inside the stump. "That's a promise." Inside the makeshift shelter, Buck found evidence of remarkable ingenuity born from desperation. Sarah had somehow managed to create a small fire pit using stones, had rigged a primitive ventilation system to prevent smoke inhalation, and had arranged pine boughs to provide insulation from the ground. She'd clearly done her best with minimal resources, but the setup was temporary at best and wouldn't survive the coming storm. Among her few possessions, Buck noticed something that seemed oddly formal amid the desperate survival situation. Papers tucked carefully inside a plastic bag, protected from the moisture. He didn't examine them closely, respecting her privacy, but he caught a glimpse of official-looking documents before Sarah quickly secured them inside her jacket. "Can you walk?" Buck asked, shouldering his pack and preparing to navigate the treacherous journey back to his cabin. "I think so," Sarah said, though the exhaustion in her voice suggested otherwise. Buck studied her face, noting the pallor of her skin and the dimity, glassy look that suggested the early stages of hypothermia. The next 2 miles would be the most critical journey of their lives, through snow that was already knee-deep and getting worse by the minute. "Stay close," he said, taking her elbow to help steady her. "Boone knows the way, even in weather like this. We follow him, we stay together, and we all get home safe." As they emerged from the stump into the full fury of the gathering storm, Buck caught Sarah looking back once at the shelter that had somehow kept her and her baby alive for 4 impossible days. There was something in that glance, gratitude, mixed with loss, as if she were saying goodbye to more than just a makeshift refuge. The journey ahead would test them all, but for the first time in 30 years, Buck Morrison was no longer walking alone through the wilderness. The weight of responsibility felt foreign after so many years of solitude, but underneath the concern and urgency, he felt something else stirring, a sense of purpose he'd thought was buried forever with Elena and their unborn son. The journey back to Buck's cabin became a test of endurance that pushed all 3 of them to their limits. The blizzard had arrived with the sudden ferocity that made mountain weather so dangerous, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of swirling white chaos. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the wind howled with a voice that seemed to mock their desperate progress through the deepening drifts. Buck had made this trek hundreds of times over the decades, but never while responsible for anyone other than himself and Boone. Sarah struggled gamely through the snow, clutching her baby protectively while fighting exhaustion that threatened to drag her down with each step. Buck found himself constantly adjusting his pace, torn between the need for speed and Sarah's obvious physical limitations. "How much farther?" Sarah gasped during one of their brief rest stops, her words nearly lost in the wind. "About a mile," Buck replied, though he knew that mile might as well be 10 given their current rate of progress. The cold was becoming dangerous. He could see the telltale signs of hypothermia creeping into Sarah's movements, the slight confusion and stumbling that meant her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. Boone proved invaluable during the treacherous journey, somehow managing to find the safest route through terrain that had been completely transformed by the storm. The old dog's instincts remained sharp despite his age, and more than once his guidance saved them from hidden obstacles or dangerous ground concealed by the snow. When Buck's cabin finally emerged from the swirling white like a beacon of salvation, Sarah actually cried with relief. The structure looked impossibly welcoming after their ordeal, its solid logs and snow-covered roof promising warmth and safety. Buck quickly ushered them inside, grateful to escape the wind's brutal assault. The contrast between the storm's fury and the cabin's warmth was so dramatic that Sarah stood frozen just inside the door, as if afraid to believe they'd truly found safety. Her baby had grown ominously quiet during the final stretch of their journey, and Buck knew that getting them both warm and fed was now a race against time. "Sit by the fire," Buck commanded, already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to mountain emergencies. He stirred the banked coals in his fireplace back to life, adding kindling and logs until flames began dancing hungrily across the wood. The cabin's interior quickly filled with blessed warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. While the fire built strength, Buck prepared what amounted to a field hospital in his living area. He dragged extra blankets from his bedroom, set water to boiling on his wood stove, and gathered medical supplies from the well-stocked first aid kit that had served him through countless minor emergencies over the years. Sarah had collapsed into the chair closest to the fire, still holding her baby with fierce protectiveness. Buck could see that both mother and child were in the early stages of hypothermia. Their skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and Sarah's shivering had become the violent tremors that indicated her body's desperate attempt to generate heat. "We need to get you both into dry clothes," Buck said gently, trying to project calm authority despite his growing concern. "I've got some old thermal underwear that should fit you, and we can wrap the baby in warm blankets." Sarah's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the sparse but comfortable furnishings. The shelves lined with books, a chess set sitting on a small table near the window. Buck watched her, cataloging potential exits and hiding places, the behavior of someone who'd learned to always plan for the worst. "There's an old music box in the bedroom chest," Buck said, surprising himself with the admission. "Elena used to wind it up and listen to the melody while she did her sewing. It might help calm the baby." The mention of Elena seemed to break through Sarah's defensive posture. She looked at Buck with something approaching curiosity rather than pure survival instinct. "Elena was your wife?" she asked, her voice still shaky from cold, but gentler than before. "Was," Buck confirmed, not trusting himself to elaborate. "Long time ago." Buck retrieved the music box from his bedroom, a delicate wooden creation that Elena had treasured, carved with tiny dancing figures and fitted with a mechanism that played a soft, haunting melody. He'd kept it all these years despite the painful memories it evoked, unable to bring himself to discard one of the few tangible connections to his lost life. The baby responded to the music box's gentle tune almost immediately, her fussing quieting as the melody filled the cabin with its bittersweet notes. Sarah watched in wonder as her daughter seemed to find peace in the simple music, and for the first time since their arrival, some of the desperate tension left her shoulders. "She likes it," Sarah whispered, tears gathering in her eyes again. "What's her name?" Buck asked, busying himself with preparing warm milk and honey, a mixture he'd learned could help with hypothermia recovery. Sarah said, the word carrying infinite tenderness. "I named her Grace because—" She stopped herself, as if revealing too much. "Because what?" "Because I hoped she might bring some grace back into the world," Sarah finished quietly. "God knows there's little enough of it." Buck felt something twist inside his chest at the profound sadness in those words. This young woman had clearly endured more than her share of the world's cruelty, yet she'd chosen to name her daughter after hope itself. As the evening progressed and the storm continued its assault outside, Buck found himself observing Sarah with the careful attention he usually reserved for reading weather patterns or tracking game. She was intelligent, that much was obvious, from the way she'd managed to survive 4 days in the wilderness with a newborn. But there was something else, a quality of refinement that seemed at odds with her desperate circumstances. Her speech patterns occasionally revealed traces of education, formal phrases that slipped out before she caught herself and reverted to simpler language. When she thought Buck wasn't looking, he caught her studying the books on his shelves with obvious hunger, her fingers tracing the spines of volumes on philosophy and literature. The birth certificate and other documents she'd protected so carefully remained tucked securely inside her jacket, but Buck had noticed the quality of the paper, the official seals that suggested government documents of some importance. Whatever Sarah's story was, it involved more than simple domestic violence, though that alone would have been a sufficient reason for her desperate flight. Grace had responded well to the warmth and care, her color improving dramatically once they'd gotten her properly fed and warm. Buck had improvised a cradle using a wooden crate lined with soft blankets, positioning it near the fire where the baby could stay warm but safe from sparks. The sight of the tiny infant sleeping peacefully in his rough-hewn cabin stirred emotions he'd thought permanently buried. As night settled fully around them and the storm showed no signs of abating, Buck realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever had driven Sarah into the mountains with her newborn daughter was still out there, waiting for the weather to clear. And despite 30 years of careful isolation, he was now committed to protecting them both. The question that nagged at him as he prepared makeshift sleeping arrangements was simple but troubling. What exactly was he protecting them from? And would his remote cabin be sanctuary enough when the real danger finally came looking for them? The storm raged for 3 days, sealing them inside the cabin as effectively as any prison. Buck had weathered countless blizzards alone, but sharing his refuge with Sarah and Grace transformed the experience entirely. The cabin that had felt spacious enough for one man and his dog suddenly seemed intimate, charged with the complex dynamics of strangers forced into close quarters by circumstances beyond their control. During those first days, Buck discovered that Sarah possessed a remarkable ability to make herself useful despite her recent trauma and exhaustion. She insisted on helping with meals, demonstrated an unexpected skill at mending clothes, and showed an intuitive understanding of infant care that suggested this wasn't her first experience with babies. When Buck mentioned this observation, Sarah's face clouded over and she changed the subject quickly. "You've done this before," he said one morning as he watched her. "Efficiently diaper. Grace, with movements born of practice. I worked at a daycare center," Sarah replied, not meeting his eyes. "Before." Buck didn't press, but he filed the information away with the growing collection of details that painted a picture of someone whose life had been far more complex than her current, desperate circumstances suggested. The way she unconsciously corrected her grammar, her familiarity with the medical terminology when discussing Grace's needs, her obvious comfort with books, all of it pointed to a background that contradicted her current status as a homeless fugitive. On the second day, while Sarah slept and Grace napped peacefully in her makeshift cradle, Buck discovered something that deepened the mystery. Sarah's jacket had fallen from the chair where she'd draped it, and several items scattered across the floor. Buck moved to gather them before Sarah woke, not wanting her to think he'd been prying, but one object stopped him cold. Among the scattered belongings was a hospital identification bracelet, the kind given to new mothers after delivery. But this one bore a name that wasn't Sarah. It read Jennifer Walsh, along with a room number and dates that indicated Grace had been born less than 2 weeks ago. Buck stared at the bracelet for a long moment, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. He carefully replaced everything exactly where it had fallen and retreated to his kitchen. But the discovery troubled him deeply. If Sarah wasn't her real name, then everything else about her story was potentially suspect as well. The question was whether the deception was born from necessity or something darker. That afternoon, as the wind howled around the cabin with undiminished fury, Buck found Sarah standing at his bookshelf, her finger tracing the spine of a volume on Montana legal statutes. She jerked her hand away when she noticed him watching, but not before he caught the hunger in her. Expression. "Feel free to read anything you'd like," Buck said carefully. Books are meant to be shared. Sarah's smile was wan, but grateful. I haven't had time to read in so long. Before I used to. She stopped herself again, that same quick retreat whenever she approached anything personal. Before what? This time, instead of deflecting, Sarah seemed to make a decision. She pulled the law book from the shelf and held it against her chest like armor. Before I realized that knowing the law and being able to use it are two very different things, she said with bitter honesty. The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Buck poured himself coffee and offered Sarah tea, buying time to process this latest revelation. A woman familiar with legal statutes, comfortable with formal language, possessing documents important enough to protect, even while fleeing for her life. The picture was becoming clearer, but also more troubling. Sarah, Buck said slowly, I want you to know that whatever brought you up here, whatever you're running from, it's safe to tell me the truth. I've got no love for people who hurt women and children, and I've got less love for authority figures who fail to protect them. Sarah clutched the law book tighter, her green eyes searching Buck's face as if trying to judge whether his words could be trusted. Grace stirred in her cradle, making the small sounds that indicated she was waking, and Sarah immediately moved to tend to her daughter with the fierce protectiveness that seemed to drive her every action. The truth is complicated, she said finally, settling into the chair by the fire with Grace cradled against her shoulder. Most important truths are, Buck replied. For the next hour, as snow continued to batter the windows and the fire crackled peacefully in the hearth, Sarah gradually revealed pieces of her real story. Her name was indeed Jennifer Walsh, not Sarah. She'd chosen the alias because it had been her grandmother's middle name. She was 24 years old and had graduated from law school 2 years earlier, specializing in domestic violence advocacy. The irony of her specialty was not lost on either of them. Jennifer had spent her professional life helping other women escape abusive relationships, only to find herself trapped in one when she married Richard Walsh, a successful attorney with political connections and a carefully hidden capacity for violence. I thought I was smarter than the women who came to me for help, Jennifer admitted, her voice thick with self-recrimination. I thought I could recognize the signs, protect myself. I was wrong. Richard had been charming during their courtship, supportive of her career, everything she'd thought she wanted in a partner. The abuse had begun subtly after their marriage, criticism disguised as concern, isolation presented as protection, control wrapped in the language of love. By the time Jennifer recognized the pattern, she was pregnant, and Richard had effectively cut her off from friends, family, and professional support networks. When Grace was born, something changed in him, Jennifer continued, her hand instinctively stroking her daughter's back. He started talking about how she would be raised, the kind of life he had planned for her. It was like she wasn't a baby to him, she was property. The breaking point had come when Jennifer discovered Richard's plans to have her declared mentally unstable so he could gain full custody of Grace. Using his legal connections and carefully documented evidence of her supposed psychological breakdown, he'd been systematically building a case that would give him complete control over their daughter. He had it all planned out, Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctors who would testify, the psychiatric evaluation that would support his claims, even the facility where I'd be committed for treatment. Grace would disappear into his world, and I'd be powerless to stop it. Buck felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, the same righteous fury he'd experienced when confronting injustice during his ranch days. The picture Jennifer painted was of systematic psychological warfare, waged by someone with the resources and connections to manipulate the very system that should have protected her. "So you ran," Buck said, understanding flooding through him. "I ran," Jennifer confirmed. "I took Grace and what little I could carry, and I ran into the only place I thought he couldn't follow, the wilderness. On the 4th day, the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached the cabin's windowsills. The silence that followed the wind's fury was profound, but Buck knew it was temporary, the kind of crystalline calm that preceded either healing or danger. As he surveyed the pristine landscape through his frost-etched windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that their brief respite was ending. Jennifer had grown stronger during their enforced isolation, the hypothermia and exhaustion gradually giving way to a determined resilience that reminded Buck of the mountain women he'd known in his younger days. She'd taken over much of the cooking, demonstrating a skill that suggested formal training rather than casual experience. When he complimented her biscuits, she smiled with the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her. "My grandmother taught me," she said, kneading dough with practiced efficiency. She believed a woman should be able to feed her family properly, no matter the circumstances. "Smart woman," Buck replied, watching Jennifer work. "These mountains have a way of testing every skill you've got." It was during that conversation that Buck noticed Jennifer studying his radio equipment with obvious interest. He kept a powerful ham radio for emergency communication, though he rarely used it except to check weather reports and maintain his minimal in contact with the outside world. "Does that reach very far?" Jennifer asked, trying to sound casual. "Depends on conditions," Buck said carefully. "Why?" Jennifer's face clouded over, and she returned her attention to the biscuit dough with sudden intensity. "Just wondering if anyone could track radio signals." The question sent a chill through Buck that had nothing to do with mountain cold. He'd been assuming that their isolation provided complete protection, but Jennifer's legal background clearly included knowledge about surveillance and tracking that he lacked. If Richard Walsh had the resources and connections she described, he might well have access to technology that could locate them even in this remote location. "Jennifer," Buck said quietly, "what exactly are we dealing with here? What kind of resources does your husband have?" She was quiet for so long that Buck thought she wouldn't answer. Grace stirred in her cradle, making soft baby sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the cabin's stillness. Finally, Jennifer set down her mixing bowl and turned to face Buck directly. "Richard isn't just any lawyer," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "His father is a federal judge. His brother works for the state attorney general's office, and he has contracts with several law enforcement agencies. When I say he has connections, I mean he has people who owe him favors in positions to make those favors very dangerous." Buck felt his stomach drop. He'd dealt with local law enforcement over the years, mostly the sheriff checking on his welfare, but federal involvement was something entirely different. If Jennifer was right about her husband's reach, their mountain sanctuary might not be the refuge he'd assumed. "There's something else," Jennifer continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night before I left, I overheard Richard on a phone call. He was talking to someone about cleaning up loose ends and making sure there were no witnesses to complicate his story." The implication hit Buck like a physical blow. "He's not just planning to get Grace back, he's planning to eliminate you entirely." Jennifer nodded, tears starting down her cheeks. "I think the official story will be that I had a complete psychological breakdown, took Grace into the wilderness, and died by accident or suicide. Richard becomes the grieving widower who tried everything to save his mentally ill wife." Buck moved to the window, scanning the tree line with new urgency. The pristine snow that had seemed so beautiful moments before now felt like a trap, their tracks clearly visible to anyone with the skills to follow them. More troubling, the radio towers he could see in the distance, equipment he'd never paid much attention to, suddenly seemed ominous. "We need to assume they can find us," Buck said, his mind already shifting into the tactical planning mode that had served him during his ranch days when dealing with rustlers and other threats. "The question is how long we have and what we do when they come." Jennifer pulled a folded paper from her jacket, one of the documents she'd protected so carefully during their flight. Buck recognized it as a topographical map of the region, marked with handwritten notations in what appeared to be a systematic search pattern. "I think they're already looking," she said, pointing to the marks on the map. Before I left town, I noticed the same car parked near my apartment 3 days in a row. When I tried to vary my routine, it moved too. Richard was already having me watched. Buck studied the map, his experienced eye reading the terrain with the skill of someone who'd spent decades navigating these mountains. The search pattern was methodical and professional, the kind of grid system that suggested military or law enforcement training. Whoever was conducting it knew what they were doing. "How much time passed between when you left and when you found the stump?" Buck asked. 5 days, Jennifer replied. "Maybe 6. I lost track after the first night." Buck did rapid calculations in his head. 5 or 6 days to cover the distance from town to their current location, allowing for the slow progress of someone carrying a newborn through difficult terrain. If the search had begun immediately after Jennifer's disappearance, the pursuers could already be close. As if summoned by his thoughts, Boone suddenly raised his head from his position by the fire, ears pricked and alert. The dog moved to the door with the focused attention that meant he'd detected something beyond normal forest sounds. Buck moved quietly to his rifle rack, selecting his most reliable weapon, a .30-06 that had never failed him in 3 decades of mountain living. He checked the action and loaded it with practiced efficiency, the familiar weight of the weapon both comforting and ominous. "What is it?" Jennifer whispered, instinctively moving to shield. "Grace with her body. Maybe nothing," Buck replied, but his eyes were hard as he peered through the window toward the direction that had caught Boone's attention. "But we need to be ready for anything." The silence stretched between them, broken only by Grace's soft breathing and the settling sounds of the cabin. Buck found himself remembering Elena's final morning, how normal everything had seemed before tragedy struck without warning. The difference was that this time, he might actually be able to protect the people who mattered. In the distance, barely audible above the mountain stillness, came the sound that Buck had been dreading, the drone of helicopter rotors, still far away, but definitely approaching their location. "Jennifer," Buck said quietly, "it's time to go." The helicopter's approach forced them into a desperate evacuation that tested every survival skill Buck had accumulated over 30 years in the mountains. Within minutes, he had transformed from reluctant hermit to tactical commander, his movements sharp and purposeful as he gathered essential supplies, while Jennifer prepared Grace for another harrowing journey into the wilderness. "There's a cave system about 3 miles north," Buck said, stuffing his pack with emergency rations and medical supplies. "It's not on any official maps, and the entrance is hidden enough that searchers would need to know exactly where to look." Jennifer secured Grace in a makeshift sling fashioned from Buck's spare thermal shirt, the baby's face barely visible beneath layers of protective cloth. The improvised carrier would keep Grace close to Jennifer's body heat while leaving both hands free for the treacherous navigation ahead. "What about Boone?" Jennifer asked, glancing at the old dog who watched their preparations with obvious anxiety. "He comes with us," Buck said firmly. "Boone knows these mountains better than any search team, and we'll need his instincts where we're going." They slipped out of the cabin's back door just as the helicopter sound grew close enough to suggest visual contact was imminent. Buck led them into the dense pine forest behind his property, following animal trails that were invisible to untrained eyes, but had served as highways for deer and elk for countless generations. The snow was treacherously deep, requiring them to move slowly despite their urgent need for distance. Buck broke trail, while Jennifer followed in his footsteps, each step a calculated risk that could mean the difference between escape and capture. Behind them, the helicopter noise grew louder, joined by what sounded like additional aircraft converging on Buck's cabin. "They're not wasting any resources," Buck muttered, pausing to help Jennifer navigate a particularly difficult section where fallen trees created natural barriers beneath the snow. 20 minutes into their flight, they heard the sound that confirmed Buck's worst fears, the deep baying of tracking dogs carried on. The wind from the direction of his cabin, Professional search teams had arrived with everything needed for a comprehensive manhunt in mountain terrain. "How long before they pick up our trail?" Jennifer asked, breathing hard from the exertion of moving through deep snow while carrying Grace. "Not long," Buck admitted. "Snow this fresh holds scent well, and we're leaving tracks a blind man could follow." Buck's mind raced through their options, weighing speed against concealment, immediate safety against long-term survival. The cave system he'd mentioned was real, a network of limestone passages he'd discovered years earlier while tracking an injured elk. But reaching it would require crossing open ground that would leave them exposed if the search teams had aerial surveillance. As they climbed higher into the mountain's heart, Buck found himself accessing memories and skills he'd thought were permanently buried with his past life. During his ranch days, he'd dealt with rustlers who used similar tactics, overwhelming force, professional tracking, systematic searches designed to leave no escape routes. The key to survival wasn't outrunning such operations, but outsmarting them. "We need to split the trail," Buck said, stopping at a rocky outcropping where the snow was thinner. "Give them something to follow that doesn't lead where we're actually going." Using techniques he'd learned from old-timers who'd lived through range wars and cattle feuds, Buck created false trails that would confuse tracking dogs and waste precious time. He scattered some of their gear in directions that led nowhere, created boot prints that suggested they'd headed toward easier escape routes, and even left traces of scent that would give the dogs something to pursue while the real quarry moved in an entirely different direction. The deception cost them valuable time, but Buck knew it was essential. Jennifer watched him work with obvious amazement, seeing for the first time the depth of knowledge that 30 years of mountain living had provided. "You've done this before," she observed as Buck carefully erased their actual tracks using pine boughs. "Different circumstances," Buck replied. "But some principles don't change. People who hunt other people tend to think in predictable patterns. You survive by thinking differently." As they resumed their climb toward the cave system, Jennifer shared more details about Richard's resources that painted an increasingly dire picture. Her husband had access to private investigators, retired military personnel who worked as security consultants, and law enforcement contacts who could provide equipment and expertise normally reserved for federal manhunts. "He told me once that he never lost a case because he prepared for every possible contingency," Jennifer said, adjusting Grace's position to protect the baby from wind that was growing stronger as they gained elevation. "I think this is what he meant," Buck found. Jennifer's legal knowledge invaluable as they planned their next moves. She understood the limitations of search warrants, the jurisdictional issues that might constrain official law enforcement involvement, and the legal gray areas where private security contractors might operate without normal oversight. If Richard is using private contractors for the actual search, they don't have the same restrictions as police, Jennifer explained as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "They can pursue us across property boundaries, use surveillance equipment that might not be legal for official investigations, and employ tactics that would get real cops in trouble." The cave entrance, when they finally reached it, was everything Buck had promised: a narrow opening in the limestone cliff face, concealed by centuries of rockfall and vegetation growth. To someone unfamiliar with the area, it would appear to be nothing more than a shadow among the stones. Inside, the cave system opened into a surprisingly large chamber, warmed by geothermal heat that kept the temperature well above freezing, even during the harshest winter weather. Buck had cached emergency supplies here years earlier, understanding that mountain living sometimes required multiple fallback positions. As they settled into their temporary refuge, Buck retrieved one of his most prized possessions from the supply cache, a detailed journal he'd kept during his early years in the mountains, documenting every trail, every shelter, every source of food and water within a 50-mile radius. The handwritten notes represented decades of exploration and careful observation, knowledge that no search team could replicate. "This is how we beat them," Buck said, showing Jennifer the journal's meticulous maps and observations. "They know technology and procedures, but they don't know this land. That's our advantage." Jennifer studied the hand-drawn maps with the appreciation of someone who understood their value. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, haven't you?" "Maybe not this exact situation, but something like it." Buck considered her words as Grace slept peacefully in her mother's arms, the baby's quiet breathing the only sound in the cave's depths. "Maybe I have," he admitted. "Sometimes a man doesn't know what he's preparing for until the moment arrives." Outside their refuge, the sound of helicopters continued, joined now by the distant barking of search dogs. The hunt was intensifying, but for the first time since their flight began, Buck felt they might actually have a chance to survive it. 3 days into their cave refuge, Buck's carefully constructed understanding of their situation shattered completely when Jennifer made a discovery that changed everything. While organizing their limited supplies, she'd been examining Buck's survival journal more closely, and something in the handwritten notes had caught her attention. Something that made her face go pale with recognition. "Buck," Jennifer said, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't identify. "This entry here, from 15 years ago. You wrote about finding evidence of someone living rough in the mountains, someone you thought might be running from the law." Buck looked over her shoulder at the page she indicated, trying to remember the incident. It had been during one of his routine explorations of the deeper mountain regions when he discovered signs of a temporary camp that suggested someone with survival skills had been living off the land for an extended period. "I remember that," Buck said slowly. "Found a lean-to shelter, cold fire ring, some gear that looked military surplus. Whoever it was had good fieldcraft, knew how to hide their presence. I assumed it was maybe a deserter or someone avoiding warrants." Jennifer's hands were shaking as she turned to another page, then another. "You made notes about tracking this person's movements, documented their camp locations over several months. You were worried they might be dangerous." "They weren't," Buck said, confused by Jennifer's intensity. "Eventually, the signs disappeared. I figured they moved on or maybe found their way back to civilization. Why does this matter now?" Instead of answering, Jennifer pulled out the birth certificate Buck had noticed during their first night in his cabin. But this time, she unfolded it completely, revealing details he hadn't seen before. The document showed Grace's father as unknown, but there was another name listed under emergency contact, a name that made Buck's blood run cold. "Sarah Walsh," he read aloud, then looked up at Jennifer with dawning comprehension. "But you said your name was Jennifer Walsh." "It is," Jennifer whispered. "Sarah was my sister." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The survival skills Jennifer had demonstrated, her familiarity with living rough, the way she'd known exactly how to create. Shelter in the hollow stump, none of it had come from a daycare job or legal education. "Jennifer, what aren't you telling me?" With tears streaming down her face, Jennifer told him the truth she'd been hiding since that first night in the blizzard. Sarah Walsh had been 2 years younger than Jennifer, a wildlife biologist who'd specialized in mountain ecosystems. She'd been conducting research in the Glacier National Park region 15 years ago, when she'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see: a meeting between Richard Walsh and several men who were involved in illegal mining operations on protected federal land. "Sarah was in the wrong place at the wrong time," Jennifer continued, her voice breaking. She saw Richard taking payoffs from mining executives, documented the conversation with her camera. When she tried to report it through proper channels, she discovered that Richard's connections went higher than she'd imagined. Buck felt the world shifting around him as the implications became clear. The person he'd been tracking 15 years ago, the skilled survivor who'd been living rough in his mountains, had been Jennifer's sister, and she'd been running from the same man who was now hunting Jennifer and Grace. "Sarah came to you for help," Buck said, understanding flooding through him. "She tried to, Jennifer said bitterly, but Richard found her first. The official report said she fell from a cliff while conducting research on accidental death. But I knew better. Sarah was too experienced, too careful to make that kind of mistake. The survival journal suddenly took on new significance. Buck flipped through the pages with growing horror, realizing that he'd been documenting not just a fugitive's movements, but Sarah's desperate attempts to stay alive long enough to expose Richard's criminal activities. She left evidence, Jennifer said, pulling another document from her jacket, this one a detailed letter written in careful handwriting, hidden in a place she knew I would eventually find. She documented everything about Richard's mining scheme, the bribes, the environmental damage they were covering up. Buck read the letter with mounting anger. Sarah Walsh had been a dedicated scientist trying to protect the wilderness Buck loved, and she died because she'd threatened the criminal enterprise of a man who used his legal position to cover his tracks. Richard killed your sister to protect his secrets, Buck said, the words heavy with grim certainty. And now he's trying to kill me for the same reason, Jennifer replied. Because I found Sarah's evidence and I know the truth about what happened to her. The revelation recontextualized everything about their situation. This wasn't just about domestic abuse or child custody. It was about a 15-year-old murder and ongoing criminal conspiracy that reached deep into Montana's legal and political establishment. Grace isn't just your daughter, Buck realized. She's a witness. Even as a baby, her existence proves Jennifer Walsh was alive long enough to give birth, which contradicts whatever story Richard has been telling about your supposed mental breakdown. Jennifer nodded miserably. As long as Grace and I are alive, we're proof that Richard's version of events is a lie. He can't risk letting us surface anywhere that we might be able to tell our story. Buck studied the survival journal with new eyes, seeing his old observations about Sarah's movements as a tragic record of her final weeks. She'd been trying to survive long enough to get her evidence to someone who could act on it, but she'd been operating alone in hostile territory against an enemy with virtually unlimited resources. Your sister was brave, Buck said quietly. She almost made it. She made it long enough to leave me the tools to finish what she started, Jennifer replied, showing Buck additional documents hidden in her jacket. Bank records, photographs, recorded conversations, everything needed to expose Richard's entire operation. Buck felt something fundamental shift inside him as the full scope of their situation became clear. This was no longer about providing temporary shelter to domestic violence victims. This was about completing a mission that Sarah Walsh had died for and ensuring that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Jennifer, Buck said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a respected ranch foreman decades earlier. We're not just running from your husband anymore. We're going to bring him down. But even as he spoke the words, Buck knew that their situation had become exponentially more dangerous. Richard Walsh wasn't just trying to recover his wife and child, he was protecting a criminal empire that had already claimed one life and wouldn't hesitate to claim more. The sound of helicopters had been absent for the past day, but Buck no longer found that reassuring. If Jennifer was right about her husband's resources and connections, the temporary quiet might simply mean that the search had shifted to different tactics, ones that might be even more difficult to detect or escape. As Grace slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she represented the final piece of evidence needed to expose a 15-year-old conspiracy, Buck realized that their fight was just beginning. Sarah Walsh's survival journal had documented her desperate flight through these same mountains, but it would be up to them to complete her mission and ensure that the truth finally came to light. The question was whether they could accomplish what Sarah couldn't survive long enough to make Richard Walsh face justice for both his past crimes and his current pursuit. The mountains that had protected Buck for 30 years were about to become the setting for a final confrontation that would determine not just their survival, but whether Sarah Walsh's death would finally be avenged. The revelation about Sarah's fate transformed Buck from reluctant protector into determined avenger. but it also forced them to confront the stark reality of their situation. They were trapped in a cave system with a newborn baby, facing an enemy with virtually unlimited resources, while winter weather made escape increasingly treacherous. The evidence Jennifer carried could destroy Richard Walsh's empire, but only if they could survive long enough to get it to someone with the power and integrity to act on it. Buck spent the next morning studying Sarah's documentation with the meticulous attention he'd once devoted to analyzing cattle breeding records. The evidence was damning: photographs of Richard accepting envelopes filled with cash, detailed records of mining permits granted in exchange for bribes, environmental impact reports that had been falsified to conceal illegal strip mining operations on federal land. "Your sister was thorough," Buck said, spreading the documents across the cave floor. "This isn't just enough to convict Richard. This could bring down half the mining establishment in Montana." Jennifer nodded grimly while nursing Grace. The baby's contentment, a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation. "Sarah always said that if you're going to take on corruption, you'd better have enough evidence to make it stick." She knew that people with Richard's connections don't go down easy. The challenge now was getting that evidence to someone who could act on it without alerting Richard's network of corrupted officials. Jennifer's legal background made her acutely aware of how many people in Montana's law enforcement and judicial system might be compromised, either through direct corruption or simple professional relationships with Richard's family. "We need to go federal," Jennifer said, studying Buck's topographical maps. "The FBI has a field office in Great Falls, about 150 miles from here. If we can reach them with Sarah's evidence." "That's a big if," Buck interrupted. "Even assuming we could make that distance in winter conditions with a baby, there's no guarantee Richard doesn't have contacts in federal law enforcement too." Buck had been thinking strategically about their options, applying the same methodical planning that had made him successful at managing large-scale ranch operations. The key was understanding their resources, their enemies' weaknesses, and the terrain that would determine the outcome of their confrontation. "Richard's strength is also his weakness," Buck said, pointing to Jennifer's marked map, showing the search patterns. "He's used to fighting legal battles, where he controls the rules and the battlefield. Out here, those advantages disappear." Over the next several hours, Buck outlined a plan that was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Instead of continuing to run from Richard's search teams, they would use Buck's knowledge of the mountains to turn the tables, drawing Richard himself into terrain where his resources became liabilities and his urban advantages meant nothing. "You want to lure him up here?" Jennifer asked, her face pale with concern. "I want to force him into a situation where he has to come alone," Buck clarified. "Rich, powerful men like Richard don't like getting their hands dirty personally. But if we make it clear that we have Sarah's evidence and we're prepared to release it unless he meets our terms, his ego won't let him send subordinates to handle it." The plan required Jennifer to use Buck's ham radio to contact someone in Richard's organization, not to surrender, but to propose a trade. They would offer to return all of Sarah's evidence in exchange for guaranteed safe passage out of Montana. The key was making Richard believe that they were desperate enough to negotiate, but still dangerous enough that he couldn't simply ignore them. "He'll never believe we'd just give up the evidence," Jennifer protested. "He will if we make it seem like our only other option is death," Buck replied. "Rich men understand cost-benefit analysis. If we convince him that pursuing us indefinitely is more expensive and risky than making a deal, he might bite." But Buck's real plan was far more dangerous than simple negotiation. He intended to use Richard's arrogance and unfamiliarity with mountain conditions to create a confrontation where Sarah's killer would finally face justice, not in a courtroom where Richard's connections could protect him, but in the wilderness, where survival depended on skills rather than influence. Jennifer studied Buck's face with growing understanding and alarm. "You're not planning to negotiate with him at all. You're planning to kill him." "I'm planning to give him exactly what he gave your sister," Buck said quietly. A chance to survive on his own merit in country that doesn't care about his money or connections. The moral implications of Buck's plan created tension between them that hadn't existed before. Jennifer's legal training made her instinctively recoil from vigilante justice, even when the target was someone who had murdered her sister and was now trying to kill her and Grace. "There has to be another way," she insisted. "If we become killers too, how are we any better than Richard?" "Because we're protecting innocent life instead of destroying it," Buck replied. "Your sister tried to work within the system, and the system failed her. Sometimes a man has to choose between legal justice and real justice." Their debate continued through the afternoon as wind howled outside their cave refuge, reminding them that winter weather remained as dangerous as human enemies. Grace slept peacefully through their discussions, her innocent presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Eventually, Jennifer's practical nature overcame her ethical concerns. "Even if I agreed to your plan, how would we actually execute it? Richard isn't going to come alone into the mountains just because we ask him to." Buck smiled grimly and pulled out his ace in the hole, a detailed topographical map that showed something Jennifer's legal documents hadn't revealed. Sarah's evidence included GPS coordinates for the illegal mining operations, and those coordinates were located in terrain that Buck knew intimately. "The mining sites are all in the Hollow Creek drainage," Buck explained, pointing to the map. "I've been hunting and trapping in that area for decades. It's rough country, steep terrain, unpredictable weather, easy to get lost if you don't know the landmarks." Buck's plan was to force Richard to the original crime scene using the mining evidence as bait. They would claim to have hidden additional documentation at the illegal mining sites, material that would be released to the media if they didn't return safely within a specified time frame. "Richard won't be able to resist the opportunity to recover that evidence personally," Buck continued. "He can't trust anyone else with something that explosive, and he can't risk letting us dictate the terms indefinitely." The beauty of the plan was that it played to Richard's psychology while using Buck's greatest advantages, knowledge of the terrain and decades of mountain survival experience. Richard would come prepared for a business negotiation, not a wilderness survival challenge. Jennifer remained conflicted about the ethical implications, but she gradually began contributing tactical suggestions that improved Buck's basic strategy. Her legal knowledge helped them craft demands that would sound credible, while her understanding of Richard's personality provided insights into how he might react to different approaches. As evening approached and their planning session reached its conclusion, Buck felt the familiar pre-action tension that he remembered from his ranch days when dealing with dangerous situations. The difference was that this time the stakes were infinitely higher, not just property or livestock, but the lives of the woman and child who had become more important to him than his own safety. "Once we set this in motion, there's no going back," Buck warned Jennifer. "Richard will know exactly where we are, and he'll come with everything he's got." Jennifer looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Buck with determination that reminded him powerfully of her sister's courage. "Sarah died trying to expose the truth," she said quietly. "If we don't finish what she started, Grace will never be safe. Richard will always be looking for us, always be a threat." Buck nodded, understanding that Jennifer had made the same calculation he had, that their only chance for real safety lay not in continued flight, but in finally confronting the enemy who had been hunting them both for 15 years. The next morning, they would begin the most dangerous phase of their journey, using Buck's radio to contact Richard Walsh and set the final confrontation in motion. The mountains that had protected Buck for 30 years would soon become the stage for a reckoning that was 15 years overdue. The radio contact with Richard Walsh's people came easier than Buck had expected, which immediately put him on edge. Within hours of Jennifer's carefully worded message, transmitted through encrypted channels to Richard's private security firm, they received a response that was both professional and menacing. Mrs. Walsh. The voice crackled through Buck's ham radio setup. This is Mr. Davidson, representing your husband's interests. We understand you have materials that belong to Mr. Walsh, and we're prepared to discuss terms for their return. Jennifer's hands shook as she keyed the microphone, but her voice remained steady. I want to speak directly to Richard. No intermediaries, no lawyers, no security contractors, just him. That's not how these situations are typically handled, ma'am. This isn't a typical situation, Jennifer replied with ice in her voice. Tell Richard that I have everything Sarah collected about the Hollow Creek operations. Everything. If he wants it back, he deals with me personally. The silence that followed stretched for several minutes, long enough for Buck to wonder if they'd overplayed their hand. Then Richard Walsh's voice came through the static, and Buck felt a chill that had nothing to do with cave temperatures. Hello, Jennifer. Richard's tone was conversational, almost friendly, but underneath lay something predatory that made Buck's trigger finger itch. I've been very worried about you and Grace. This mountain adventure has gone on long enough. Has it? Jennifer shot back. The way Sarah's mountain adventure went on too long? Another pause, shorter this time, but Buck could hear the calculation in it. Richard was weighing how much Jennifer actually knew against how much he could afford to admit. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your sister's tragic accident, Richard said carefully. Perhaps we should meet and discuss this situation face to face. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that protects everyone's interests. Buck had been listening to every word, analyzing Richard's speech patterns and responses with the same attention he'd once paid to reading cattle buyers during price negotiations. Richard was confident, controlled, but there was an edge of urgency that suggested their strategy was working. The Hollow Creek drainage, Jennifer said, following the script they'd rehearsed. The old mining access road, tomorrow at noon. That's very remote terrain, Jennifer. Hardly safe for you and the baby in these weather conditions. Sarah's evidence is cached at the mining sites, Jennifer lied smoothly. The locations are very specific. You'll need to see them personally to understand what we have. Buck admired Jennifer's performance. She was managing to sound desperate enough to be credible while maintaining just enough control to keep Richard interested. The mention of cached evidence at the actual crime scenes would be irresistible to someone who'd spent 15 years believing he'd successfully covered his tracks. I'll need guarantees, Richard said. Some assurance that this isn't an ambush. You'll have one, Jennifer replied. I'll be there alone with Grace. No weapons, no backup, no way to threaten you physically. All I want is safe passage out of Montana in exchange for everything Sarah collected. It was a lie, of course. Buck would be positioned in the terrain around the meeting site with his rifle and 30 years of hunting experience. But Richard had no way of knowing that Jennifer had found the world's most dangerous ally in these mountains. Very well, Richard said after another pause. Noon tomorrow. But Jennifer, if this is some kind of trap, if you've involved law enforcement, the consequences will be severe. The only law enforcement I'm worried about is what happens when Sarah's evidence becomes public, Jennifer replied. Tomorrow, Richard. Come alone. The radio went silent, leaving them in the cave's depths with nothing but the sound of Grace's peaceful breathing and their own racing heartbeats. Buck felt the familiar pre-combat tension settling into his muscles, the heightened awareness that meant action was finally at hand. He'll come, Jennifer said with certainty. His ego won't let him send someone else to clean up a mess this personal. Buck was already planning the tactical setup, visualizing the terrain around the old mining access road and identifying the positions that would give him the best fields of fire. The Hollow Creek drainage was perfect for their purposes. Steep-sided canyon walls that would limit Richard's escape routes and plenty of cover for a patient marksman. You understand what happens tomorrow, Buck said, quietly. Once we're committed to this course, there's no backing down. Richard Walsh won't be leaving those mountains alive. Jennifer looked at Grace sleeping in her arms, then back at Buck with eyes that held no doubt. He killed my sister for trying to protect these mountains. He spent 15 years profiting from her death. Tomorrow, that ends. As they prepared for their final confrontation, Buck felt the weight of destiny settling around them like mountain weather. 30 years of isolation were about to culminate in a few violent minutes that would determine whether Sarah Walsh's sacrifice had meaning and whether her sister and niece would finally be free from the shadow of her killer. The mountains that had sheltered Buck through decades of grief and solitude were about to witness justice of the most primitive and final kind. The confrontation at Hollow Creek unfolded exactly as Buck had planned, until Richard Walsh proved that 30 years of corruption had taught him of survival skills that extended far beyond courtroom manipulation. The mining access road wound through a narrow canyon where the skeletal remains of illegal strip mining operations stood like monuments to greed, but Richard arrived with backup that Buck's careful surveillance had failed to detect. Buck had positioned himself on the canyon's north rim with clear sightlines to the meeting point, his 30-06 loaded and ready. Jennifer was precisely where she'd promised to be, standing beside her sister's makeshift memorial at the largest mining scar. Grace bundled against the cold and completely exposed. The setup was perfect for Buck's plan, until Richard's voice echoed from an unexpected direction. "I'm impressed, Jennifer," Richard called out, his words bouncing off the canyon walls from somewhere behind Buck's position. "You've managed to turn my wife into quite the tactician. Though I have to say, choosing your sister's grave for our final meeting shows a certain dramatic flair." Buck's blood turned to ice as he realized Richard had somehow circled behind him, turning the ambush inside out. Worse, the voice wasn't coming from just one location. Richard had brought professional backup position throughout the canyon. "You can put down the rifle now, Buck Morrison," Richard continued, his tone conversational, but carrying absolute authority. "Yes, I know exactly who you are. 30 years ago, you were Elena Morrison's husband, weren't you? The ranch foreman who disappeared after that tragic accident. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the man harboring my fugitive wife?" The mention of Elena hit Buck like a physical blow, but his hands remained steady on his weapon as he tried to locate Richard's actual position. The acoustics of the canyon made it impossible to pinpoint the source of the voice, and Buck realized he was facing someone who'd learned from 15 years of covering his tracks. "I know what you're thinking," Richard said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You're wondering how I found you, how I got behind you, whether you can still complete your little revenge fantasy. The answer to all those questions is simple. You're dealing with someone who's survived in a much more dangerous jungle than these mountains." Buck saw movement in his peripheral vision and swung his rifle toward it, only to realize it was Jennifer repositioning Grace to protect the baby from wind that was picking up strength. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and Buck understood that Richard had timed this confrontation to use the elements as another weapon. "Here's what's going to happen," Richard continued, his voice now clearly coming from the canyon floor near Jennifer. "You're going to come down from your perch very slowly, with your hands visible and your weapon pointed at the ground. My associates have you bracketed from 3 directions, and if you make any aggressive moves, they'll put you down like the dangerous animal you've become." Buck had spent 30 years learning to read situations where a moment's miscalculation could mean death, and every instinct told him that Richard wasn't bluffing. The man had approached this confrontation with the same methodical planning that had kept him ahead of justice for 15 years. "And Jennifer," Richard said, his tone shifting to something coldly intimate, "you're going to hand over every piece of documentation your dead sister collected, along with any copies you've made. Then you're coming home with me to face the consequences of this ridiculous adventure." "What about Grace?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Grace will be fine," Richard replied. "She'll grow up with a father who can provide for her properly, without the corrupting influence of a mother who clearly inherited your sister's talent for making poor decisions." Buck began his descent from the canyon rim, moving slowly but using every available bit of cover to conceal his exact position and intentions. Richard's confidence was built on the assumption that Buck was simply a broken-down hermit driven by emotion rather than tactical thinking. That assumption might be the only advantage Buck had left. As he picked his way down the rocky slope, Buck caught sight of Richard for the first time, a man in his 40s, well-dressed even for mountain conditions, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to having others handle physical risks. But Buck also spotted the telltale positions of at least 2 other armed men, professionals who moved with the discipline of military training. "That's far enough," Richard said when Buck reached a ledge about 50 yards above the canyon floor. "Drop the rifle and kick it away from you." Buck let his weapon fall and gave it a slight push with his boot, but not far enough to put it completely out of reach. He was gambling that Richard's arrogance would make him want to savor this moment, to explain how he'd outmaneuvered them before finishing what he'd started with Sarah 15 years ago. "You know, Buck," Richard said, stepping into full view with a pistol held casually at his side, "I actually admire what you've accomplished here. Taking in my wife, protecting my child, even organizing this elaborate ambush. It shows real initiative for a man who's been hiding from life for 3 decades. The wind was growing stronger, and Buck could smell snow in the air. Another storm was approaching, and Richard's timeline was about to become compressed, whether he wanted it to be or not. Buck's chance was coming. He just had to stay alive long enough to recognize it. The storm that saved their lives arrived with the sudden violence that made Montana mountain weather legendary, transforming Richard Walsh's carefully orchestrated trap into a struggle for basic survival that stripped away every advantage except the ones that truly mattered. The wind hit the canyon like a living thing, carrying snow so thick it reduced visibility to mere feet and turning the confrontation into something primal and immediate. Buck had been counting on the weather, reading signs that Richard's urban background had missed entirely. When the first serious gust knocked Richard off balance, Buck moved with the reflexes that 30 years of mountain living had honed to perfection. He retrieved his rifle in a diving roll that put him behind cover, just as gunfire erupted from the positions where Richard's men had been waiting. But the storm was an equalizer that favored experience over training, and Buck's knowledge of the terrain became the decisive factor. He knew exactly where the wind patterns would create blind spots, where the canyon walls would provide protection, and how the snow would accumulate to change the landscape within minutes. Richard's professional gunmen found themselves fighting the weather as much as their target, their carefully planned fields of fire becoming useless in the whiteout conditions. "Jennifer!" Buck shouted through the wind. "The old mining office east wall." Jennifer didn't hesitate, understanding that Buck's intimate knowledge of this place was their lifeline. She pressed Grace against her chest and ran for the crumbling concrete structure that had once housed the Illegal Operations Administrative Center, its thick walls offering protection from both gunfire and the storm's fury. Buck moved through the deteriorating conditions like a ghost, using routes he'd scouted during his years of hunting these mountains. He could hear Richard's men calling to each other, their voices increasingly desperate as the storm separated them from their leader and each other. Professional training was no match for terrain knowledge when visibility dropped to 0 and the temperature plummeted toward life-threatening levels. The confrontation's climax came when Buck found Richard alone, separated from his backup and struggling through snow that was already knee-deep. The man who had seemed so confident and controlled just minutes earlier now looked exactly what he was, a city dweller completely out of his element in conditions that demanded skills he'd never needed to develop. "It's over, Richard," Buck said, emerging from the swirling snow with his rifle trained on the man who had killed Sarah Walsh. "Your men are fighting the storm now, not me, and storms don't take bribes." Richard's response was to raise his pistol, but his hands were shaking from cold, and his movements had the sluggish quality that indicated the early stages of hypothermia. Buck's shot was precise and final, the 30-06 round dropping Richard into the snow beside the mining scar where his criminal enterprise had begun 15 years earlier. As Buck knelt beside Richard's body to ensure there would be no further threat, he found something that completed the circle of justice in ways he hadn't expected. Richard's jacket contained a satellite phone with recent call logs showing communications with contacts in federal law enforcement, confirmation that Jennifer's fears about corruption had been well-founded. But it also contained something else. A confession letter Richard had apparently written as insurance against his own partners, detailing the full scope of the mining conspiracy and naming everyone involved. The storm raged for 6 hours, effectively ending any threat from Richard's surviving men, who found themselves in a desperate fight for survival that left no energy for pursuing vengeance. When the weather finally cleared, Buck used Richard's satellite phone to contact the FBI field office in Great Falls, providing GPS coordinates for Sarah's evidence cache and Richard's body, along with a carefully edited version of events that painted the confrontation as self-defense during a kidnapping attempt gone wrong. The federal response was swift and thorough. Within days, investigators had recovered Sarah's complete documentation of the mining conspiracy, corroborated by Richard's own confession letter and confirmed by physical evidence at the Hollow Creek sites. The scandal that followed reached exactly as high as Sarah had predicted, bringing down a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. Jennifer's testimony before the federal grand jury was devastating in its detail and impact. The FBI agents who debriefed her found her account completely credible, supported by documentation that no defense attorney could challenge. Richard's death was ruled justified homicide in defense of others, and the surviving members of his criminal organization faced federal charges that would ensure lengthy prison sentences. But the resolution that mattered most to Buck came 3 months later, when spring had returned to the mountains and the snow had melted enough to reveal the true scope of environmental damage at the illegal mining sites. Jennifer had used her legal expertise to ensure that Sarah's death wasn't just avenged, but that her work protecting the wilderness would continue through a foundation established in her memory. The evening Buck received news that the last of Richard's co-conspirators had been sentenced, he found himself sitting on his cabin porch with a cup of coffee, watching Grace take her first tentative steps across the rough wooden planks while Jennifer applauded her daughter's progress. The sight of new life and hope flourishing in the place that had sheltered his grief for 30 years felt like the completion of something larger than justice. It felt like redemption. "She'll grow up knowing these mountains," Jennifer said, settling beside Buck on the porch steps, knowing the story of what her aunt died to protect and how a stubborn old hermit helped finish the job. Buck smiled, watching Grace toddle toward Boone with the fearless confidence that belonged only to children and mountain folk. The dog tolerated the baby's attention with patient dignity, as if understanding his role as protector of the newest member of their unlikely family. "Think she'll want to hear stories about her Aunt Sarah?" Buck asked. "Every one you can remember," Jennifer replied. "And some about the mountain man who taught her mother that sometimes the best family is the one you choose for yourself." As the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed so much sorrow and violence, Buck Morrison finally understood what Elena would have wanted him to learn from 30 years of solitude, that grief shared becomes bearable, that purpose shared becomes powerful, and that some mountains are meant to be climbed together.